The sound of laughter can cut deeper than any blade. I'll never forget the echo of Robert Maddox's voice bouncing against the glass walls of his corner office. He wasn't just laughing, he was mocking me, every chuckle a reminder of how insignificant he believed I was. All I had asked for was a 10% raise. 10% after 12 years of breaking my back, 12 years of designing systems that turned this company into a leader, 12 years of believing loyalty would one day be rewarded. I stood there holding a thick portfolio, a tangible record of my life's work, 60 pages of algorithms, improvements, efficiencies. Each line represented a night I worked while others slept, weekends sacrificed, holidays forgotten, and yet, to Robert, it was just a punchline. He leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp with that predatory gleam, and told me what I'd always feared. Everyone's replaceable, even you. Something inside me cracked. It wasn't just my pride, and it wasn't just disappointment. It was something deeper, something foundational. 12 years of loyalty collapsed in a single moment, replaced by a cold, sharp awareness. The rules of the game were never written for people like me. Hard work wasn't currency here, it was fuel. Fuel for men like Robert to build their empires, to buy their vacation homes, to stand in the spotlight while I remained invisible. My name is Emily Carson. I'm 34 years old, a supply chain algorithm specialist. And up until that moment, I was pathologically afraid of conflict. I was the woman who apologized when someone else stepped on her foot, the woman who stayed in the shadows, who believed that recognition would come if I just worked harder. But as I stood in Robert's office, clutching a portfolio that might as well have been ashes in my hands, I realized the truth. Recognition doesn't come to those who wait. It comes to those who demand it. I walked out of that glass office and into the maze of cubicles that had been my home for over a decade. 12 years, and this was what I had to show for it. A desk shoved in the corner of the 5th floor, surrounded by empty workstations. Once we had been a department of 15. Now it was just me and 2 others, the rest made redundant by the very systems I had built. The irony was cruel. My brilliance had automated away the need for my colleagues, and yet that same brilliance was invisible when it came to valuing me. On my desk, my computer blinked with the latest company newsletter. I clicked it open with shaking hands and read the headline, Maddox's Innovative Supply Chain Revolution Saves Eastward Millions. My stomach twisted. My algorithms, my late nights, my unpaid overtime, my genius had been packaged under his name. His smirk at the quarterly meetings suddenly made sense. He had been profiting from my silence for years. Beside the monitor sat a photo of my parents. My father had worked 35 years in a factory until it shut down, blindsided by a company that had valued him only as long as he could be used. Loyalty matters, he'd said to me countless times, and I had believed him. My mother had nodded in agreement, reinforcing a lesson that had guided me all my life. But staring at that photo now, I realized that loyalty in the wrong hands was just another word for slavery. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the leather notebook I had guarded for years. Inside were pages filled with ideas, notes, and sketches of algorithms I had developed in my own time. My real work, my personal projects. Some had been shared with the company in moments of naive optimism, hoping they would buy them from me, hoping I would be recognized. They hadn't. They simply implemented them quietly, without acknowledgement, without compensation. But I had been careful. Every entry in that notebook was dated, signed, marked as mine. Legally, they belonged to me. That day, as Robert's laughter still rang in my ears, I flipped through those pages and found an idea I had scribbled 3 years earlier. It was the backbone of our entire logistics system, the very system the company now bragged about to its clients. And suddenly, my despair shifted into something else. It wasn't hope yet, not fully, but it was the faint spark of power. For years, I had ignored the messages from Daniel Reeves, the operations director at Titan Logistics, our fiercest competitor. He had reached out more than once, leaving the door open, promising me recognition, promising me a seat at the table. His last message, sent 6 months ago, had been simple. The offer still stands. Innovators are valued here. That message stared back at me from my phone as I scrolled through my contacts. My finger hovered over his number. 12 years of loyalty screamed at me to stop, to be reasonable, to not burn bridges. But then I heard Robert's laughter in my head again, sharp as glass, cutting into the quiet resolve I was trying to build. I pressed call. When Daniel answered, his voice was calm but carried a note of anticipation, like he had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. "Emily Carson," he said, almost like a greeting reserved for someone who had already changed his world. I was beginning to think you'd never call. That was the night everything shifted. I hadn't taken revenge yet, and I hadn't even made a plan. But for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time, I wasn't powerless. I was holding something the company had overlooked for too long. Myself, my value, my irreplaceable genius. And I was finally ready to see what would happen when I stopped apologizing for existing. There are moments in life that carve scars so deep you can still feel them years later. My first betrayal wasn't when Robert laughed at me. That was just the final blow. The first wound happened long before, in ways so subtle I didn't recognize them until it was too late. It was the day I realized that loyalty was a one-way street. I had been at Maddox Logistics for 7 years when the Eastwood contract nearly fell apart. They were our biggest client, and one of the executives had grown frustrated with delivery times and rising costs. Panic rippled through the office. Robert paced the floor in his tailored suit, barking orders at managers who had no idea how to fix the problem. Meanwhile, I sat at my cubicle with a notebook full of solutions. Algorithms I'd been developing on weekends, scribbled equations that could cut delivery times in half, and reduce costs by nearly 40%. I remember that night vividly. The office lights were dim, most of the staff had gone home, and I stayed behind with 2 cups of black coffee. I coded through the night, my fingers aching, my mind sharp with the thrill of possibility. By dawn, I had built a working model. It wasn't perfect, but it was revolutionary. I presented it the next morning, expecting at least a nod of recognition. Robert skimmed the pages, frowned, and said only, "If it works, we'll use it." No thank you, no credit. Just a passing remark before he strode into the boardroom and presented my work as his own. When the system went live, Eastwood called it groundbreaking. They renewed their contract for 5 more years and added millions to the deal. The company celebrated with champagne. Robert toasted to innovation and leadership, and the entire board clapped for him. I sat at the back of the room, my paper cup of cheap wine trembling in my hand, knowing the truth. That was my first betrayal. I should have spoken up then, should have demanded recognition, but I told myself it didn't matter. The company was stronger, our jobs were safe, and surely someone would notice my contribution in time. Instead, I stayed quiet and swallowed the bitterness. But silence has a cost. By the 10th year, the betrayals piled up. A process improvement I created reduced fuel consumption by 20%. Robert called it his vision. A predictive model I developed saved the company millions in inventory costs. Robert presented it at an industry conference and was praised as a thought leader. Every time I watched him receive applause for my work, I told myself my time would come. The worst betrayal wasn't even professional, it was personal. I had shared some of my private algorithms with him in an email, hoping he would consider acquiring them formally. I even suggested terms for compensation, something modest, something fair. His response was dismissive. Just implement it. If it works, we'll sort out the details later. Those details never came. My innovations became company property without a single contract, without my name attached anywhere. It was betrayal dressed as indifference. He knew. He knew those systems were mine, knew I had marked them as personal projects, and he didn't care. To him, I wasn't Emily Carson, innovator. I was just another replaceable employee, a cog in his machine. But betrayal doesn't only come from above, it also came from around me, from people I thought were allies. There was a colleague, Amanda, who once shared my cubicle row. We ate lunch together, complained about late nights, even celebrated birthdays. One day, she was promoted to a managerial role, a position I had trained her for. She came to me for help understanding systems I had built, and I gave it freely, believing friendship mattered. Then I heard her in the break room telling another manager, "Emily's brilliant with the numbers, but she's not leadership material. She doesn't have the presence." Presence. That was the word they used to justify keeping me invisible. The betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just Robert anymore, it was the culture. They all believed I was meant to stay small, tucked away in a corner, useful, but never celebrated. The night Robert laughed at my raise request, it all came rushing back. The sleepless nights, the stolen credit, the empty promises. 12 years of my life given freely, and for what? A cubicle, a paycheck 20% below market, and a CEO who thought I was a joke. That's when I understood something important. Betrayal isn't just an act, it's a pattern. It repeats because you allow it, because you stay quiet, because you think patience will be rewarded. But patience is just another word for permission when you give it to the wrong people. So yes, Robert's laughter shattered me, but it was only possible because of every betrayal that came before. Every time I stayed silent, every time I told myself loyalty mattered more than recognition, every time I convinced myself that being useful was enough. That night, I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my leather notebook again. I ran my fingers over the dated entries, the proof of my genius. The betrayals had stolen my recognition, but they hadn't stolen my work. They hadn't stolen my ideas. And for the first time in 12 years, I began to think of betrayal not as something that had destroyed me, but as something that might, just might, become the foundation of my revenge. When people hear about betrayal in the workplace, they picture a cold executive, a faceless corporation. But betrayal is always more personal than that. Behind the glass walls and polished smiles are faces, names, voices, people who shaped every scar I carried. If you want to understand why I chose the path I did, you need to know them. The ones who thrived on exploitation, the ones who wore masks of charm while pulling strings that strangled the rest of us. Robert Maddox was the obvious villain, but his arrogance didn't exist in isolation. It was reinforced, protected, encouraged by an ecosystem of people who benefited from keeping others small. Take Margaret Hensley, our head of human resources. On a paper, she was a champion of fairness, always talking about employee well-being at company meetings. But when I went to her once, years before the fateful laugh, and asked about a salary adjustment, she smiled that thin, professional smile and said, "Emily, you're lucky to have stability. So many people would kill for your position. Don't rock the boat." Stability, that was the carrot they dangled to keep us in line. Margaret wasn't malicious in the way Robert was. She was complicit. And sometimes complicity is worse. It pretends to care while quietly tightening the chains. Then there was Richard Vance, our company's legal counsel. At first I thought he was just another suite in a high-rise, but over the years I noticed how he always seemed to look the other way. He drafted contracts that favored executives, not employees. He brushed off questions about intellectual property with vague phrases like standard procedure. Later, I would discover just how much he knew and how much he chose not to act on. But in those early years, he was just another cog in Robert's machine, keeping the gears turning smoothly, no matter who was crushed beneath them. And then there were my peers, the people I thought were my allies. Amanda, who once shared sandwiches with me on late nights, but whispered behind my back that I lacked leadership presence. Mark, a junior analyst I mentored who climbed the ladder quickly and began to parrot Robert's words, "Everyone's replaceable." They weren't cruel, not in the way Robert was, but they were opportunists. They learned quickly that survival meant aligning with power, not truth. The most painful introduction, though, is not of my colleagues, but of my family. Because betrayal bleeds past the office walls and into your home, shaping the way you're seen by the people closest to you. My father, Charles Carson, was a factory worker for 35 years. He was the kind of man who believed in sweat and loyalty, the kind who measured worth by how long you stuck with something. When the factory closed and he was handed a pension that barely kept the lights on, he still said, "Loyalty matters." He believed it so fiercely that I absorbed it like gospel. Every time I thought about quitting Maddox Logistics, his voice echoed in my head. "Stay, work hard, it will pay off." My mother, Diane, stood beside him, nodding. She believed in quiet endurance, in keeping the peace, in not making waves. She taught me to apologize quickly, to smooth things over, to never let conflict define me. And so, when I was undervalued, dismissed, or ignored, I smiled. I smoothed. I endured. My parents weren't villains. They were victims of a system that convinced them loyalty was currency. And they passed that belief to me, not out of malice, but out of love. But love can blind you as much as it can protect you. There was one more face, though, one that stood apart from the rest. Daniel Reeves, the operations director at Titan Logistics. I hadn't met him yet, but he lingered at the edges of my life like a shadow of possibility. He had reached out more than once, his messages patient, almost respectful. "Emily, we value innovators here. When you're ready, call me." At first I ignored him, clinging to loyalty, but in truth his presence haunted me. He represented a world outside Maddox, a world where my work might be recognized. I wasn't ready then, but knowing he existed gave me something to dream about in the quiet moments. So when you ask who shaped my downfall, the answer isn't simple. It wasn't just Robert, with his laughter and his hollow smile. It was Margaret, with her soft complicity. It was Vance, with his silence. It was Amanda, with her whispered judgments. It was my parents, with their well-meaning lessons that turned into shackles. Every face was a thread in the net that held me down. And for years, I accepted it, convinced myself it was normal, that this was what it meant to be a worker, a woman, a daughter. But here's the truth I didn't understand until much later. Every betrayal, every dismissal, every whispered doubt was not just a wound. It was a kind of training. Each face that underestimated me was sharpening the edge I would one day use to cut myself free. And when I finally rose, when I finally took my revenge, those same faces would stare at me with regret, with disbelief, with the dawning realization that they had helped build the very storm that would destroy them. Rock bottom isn't a single moment. It's not one sharp fall into darkness. It's the slow, grinding collapse of everything you thought was solid beneath your feet. I didn't realize I was falling until I had already hit the bottom, and by then it was too late to pretend I was still standing tall. The day after Robert's laughter, I sat at my cubicle staring at my screen, the glow of unread emails blurring before my eyes. Around me, the fifth floor was nearly silent. 15 people had once filled the space, buzzing with conversation and clattering keyboards. Now only 3 of us remained, ghosts in an office that felt more like a graveyard. My algorithms had automated away the need for a department, and somehow, instead of being rewarded, I had automated myself into obsolescence. Every ping of my inbox carried another demand. Update the distribution metrics. Run a model for Eastwood. Check the inventory prediction errors. Work piled up as though I hadn't just been told I was replaceable, as though my soul hadn't been cracked open the night before. I wanted to scream, but instead I answered emails. That was what 12 years of conditioning did to you. You learned to keep producing, no matter how invisible you felt. At night, the despair thickened. I would sit in my 1-bedroom apartment with the blinds closed, replaying Robert's laughter in my mind until I almost believed it was true. Maybe I really wasn't worth more. Maybe I wasn't leadership material. Maybe Amanda had been right. Maybe loyalty wasn't a mistake, but the only thing I had to offer. Sleep became a stranger. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, cataloguing every mistake I'd ever made, every chance I'd let slip away. My body grew heavy, sluggish. Food lost its taste. I dragged myself to the office each morning, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know who I was without it. Work had been my identity for 12 years. Without it, I was nothing. One evening, my mother called. Her voice was gentle, but it carried that weight of expectation I'd known all my life. Emily, your father and I are proud of you. You've built stability. That's what matters. I wanted to tell her the truth. That stability was a cage, that every day I gave more of myself away for nothing in return. But I couldn't. Instead, I swallowed the words and said, "Thanks, Mom. I'm fine." Fine, the word we use when we're dying inside. The lowest point came one Friday evening when I stayed late, working on a proposal Robert planned to present on Monday. It was my model, my numbers, my system. At 10 p.m., I was still at my desk, fluorescent lights buzzing above me when Robert's email arrived. "Good work. I'll polish this for the board. Enjoy your weekend." Polishing? That was what he called stripping my name off the project and replacing it with his. I stared at that email until my eyes burned. Something inside me whispered, "This is it. This is who you'll be forever." The ghost in the machine, the invisible genius, the replaceable one. For a terrifying moment, I believed it. I remember walking to the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror under harsh fluorescent light. My face looked pale, hollow. There were dark circles under my eyes, lines I hadn't noticed forming. I touched the glass as though I was reaching out to someone else, someone trapped inside, and I whispered, "Is this all I am?" That was my rock bottom, not the betrayal itself. But the moment I believed it, the moment I thought Robert was right, that everyone was replaceable, that I was nothing more than a cog. But here's the strange thing about hitting the bottom. Once you're there, you can finally see the ground. You can finally see what's real and what isn't. And I began to notice the cracks. The cracks in Robert's arrogance, in the company's careless legal protections, in the way they treated employees as disposable. The cracks in the story I'd told myself all my life, that loyalty was enough, that humility was noble, that patience would be rewarded. It hurt to admit it. It was like ripping off skin I'd worn for decades. But as I stood there in that flickering bathroom light, staring at my reflection, I realized something. Rock bottom wasn't the end. It was the foundation. And if I could survive this, if I could drag myself out of the pit of despair, then maybe I could build something stronger on the ruins of what had been taken from me. For now, though, I was still broken. I returned to my desk, packed my leather notebook into my bag, and walked out of Maddox Logistics for the weekend. I didn't know what I was walking toward, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. As I locked my apartment door behind me that night, the city lights glimmering through the window, I whispered a promise to myself. This is not the end of my story. Not yet. And though I couldn't see it then, that promise was the first stone I would lay on the path to something greater. The strange thing about despair is that it can either bury you or forge you. For weeks after Robert's laughter, I felt as though the weight of 12 years of invisibility would crush me. But buried beneath all that bitterness was a spark, something stubborn that refused to die. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to change. It started with the notebook. That battered leather journal I'd carried for years, filled with algorithms and half-born ideas, suddenly felt less like a hobby and more like a weapon. Each page was dated, marked, annotated, proof of my mind, proof of ownership, proof that I had created something worth more than Robert's polished suits and hollow speeches. When I held that notebook in my hands, I felt a strange clarity. They had stolen my recognition, but they hadn't stolen me. I began to study my own entries with new eyes, not as a dutiful employee, but as an innovator reclaiming what was hers. I remembered the sleepless nights when I first sketched the predictive model that cut Eastwood's cost by 40%. I remembered the joy of discovery, the rush of seeing patterns emerge in the data. For years, those moments had been overshadowed by Robert's theft of credit. But in my notebook, it was all there, my handwriting, my equations, my truth. That's when I decided to prepare, not just to leave, but to transform. Every evening after work, I came home and built a ritual. I lit a single lamp, spread my notes across the kitchen table, and worked as though my life depended on it. I documented everything, timelines, draft models, comparisons of what I had built on company time versus what I had built independently. I backed up files, emailed copies to myself, stored them on drives hidden in places no one at Maddox Logistics would ever think to look. I was archiving not just my work, but my identity. But transformation isn't only about preparation, it's about perspective. And perspective came in the form of Daniel Reeves. I still remember the moment I finally pressed call on his number. My heart hammered in my chest as though I were about to commit a crime. But when he answered, his voice was steady, almost warm. "Emily Carson," he said, as if my name was already familiar, already valuable. That simple acknowledgement, the sound of my name spoken with respect, was enough to jolt something inside me awake. We met that evening in a restaurant far nicer than any Robert had ever invited me to. Daniel was sharp, but not in the predatory way Robert was. His sharpness was curiosity, attentiveness. He spoke about my work with an understanding that stunned me. "We tried to reverse engineer your Eastwood system," he admitted, "but we couldn't." That's when I knew the genius wasn't in the code, it was in the mind behind it, in you. I don't remember the last time anyone had looked at me that way, with recognition instead of dismissal. I should have felt nervous, but instead I felt alive, like I'd been walking in darkness for years, and someone had finally opened a door. Daniel's offer was more than money, though the promise of triple my current salary and stock options was intoxicating. It was recognition, leadership, my name on my work. A team of my own. I remember staring at him across the table, my leather notebook between us, and whispering, "I just want to be seen." He nodded as though he understood more than I had spoken. "You deserve that, and more." That night, when I walked back to my apartment, I carried myself differently. My steps were quicker, lighter. The city lights reflected off the glass towers, and for the first time in years, I felt as though one of those towers might one day belong to me. But transformation isn't instant, it's a process, and mine was messy. Some nights doubt crept back in. I would sit on my couch staring at my father's old photo, hearing his voice remind me that loyalty mattered. I felt the guilt like a weight pressing on my chest. Was I betraying him by walking away? Was I betraying my mother's lessons of humility and endurance? And yet, every time I thought about surrendering to loyalty, I heard Robert's laughter again. That sharp, mocking sound was like steel in my veins. It reminded me that loyalty given to the wrong people wasn't virtue, it was slavery. So I transformed piece by piece. I sharpened my voice in small ways, refusing to apologize when someone bumped into me on the subway, correcting a manager when they misattributed my work, looking people directly in the eye when I spoke. They were tiny rebellions, but they stacked into something stronger. I began to dress differently too. No more muted sweaters and flats. I bought a tailored blazer, sharp shoes, and wore my hair differently. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. Every time I looked in the mirror, I wanted to see not the ghost Robert thought was replaceable, but the woman Daniel believed could lead an empire. And beneath the surface, my revenge was forming. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but I knew this. I wasn't going to remain invisible. Not to Robert, not to the company, not to anyone. By the time 2 weeks had passed, my despair had hardened into resolve. I wasn't just Emily Carson, the quiet specialist anymore. I was Emily Carson, the innovator, the strategist, the woman who had spent 12 years being underestimated and who was finally ready to make the world see just how irreplaceable she truly was. The day I returned, no one knew I had already left. Officially, I was still Emily Carson, tucked away in my 5th floor cubicle at Maddox Logistics, answering emails and running models. But inside, I had already crossed the line. My resignation was written, my decision made. While Robert Maddox leaned back in his leather chair, convinced of his own invincibility, I was quietly preparing to dismantle the empire he had built on my back. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but by the time I accepted Daniel Reeves's offer at Titan Logistics, I wasn't the same woman who once trembled in Robert's office. I had grown sharp edges, and now those edges would cut. I didn't announce my plans. I didn't storm into the boardroom and expose him in front of his allies. No, revenge requires patience, precision. It wasn't about theatrics, it was about impact. So I played the part of the obedient employee a little longer, nodding when spoken to, handing over models that I knew were worth millions. All the while, I kept copies of every email, every note, every line of proof that my personal projects belonged to me, not Maddox Logistics. In secret, I met with Daniel at quiet restaurants, at dimly lit coffee shops. We would sit across from one another, my leather notebook between us, as we mapped out what was to come. He asked questions no one at Maddox had ever cared to. What drives your models? What assumptions did you challenge? Where else could this be applied? His interest wasn't exploitation, it was recognition. He wanted to see me, to hear me, to understand the mind behind the numbers. For the first time, my ideas weren't being mined, they were being celebrated, but secrecy came with its own kind of torment. Each morning, I walked back into Maddox Logistics, knowing that I was betraying them as much as they had betrayed me. My father's voice haunted me. Loyalty matters. My mother's voice whispered, "Don't make waves." And yet I couldn't ignore the fire that had been lit in me. For years, they had stolen my light. Now I was reclaiming it, even if it meant burning bridges to ash. The turning point came 2 weeks later when I slid my resignation letter across Robert's desk. He barely looked up from his computer, the arrogance so thick in him that he couldn't imagine anyone walking away. 2 weeks' notice, he muttered, scanning the page. Where are you going? Titan Logistics, I said simply. That got his attention. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. Our competitor? Yes, I replied, steady now, stronger than I had ever sounded in his office before. For a moment, his practice CEO's smile faltered. That's unfortunate timing. We're finalizing negotiations with Eastwood to expand the contract. I know, I said. I built the delivery model for that proposal. It was the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He stammered something about retention options, about finally discussing that raise, but the words sounded hollow. For years he had laughed at the idea of my value. Now he wanted to buy it back, but it was too late. Those last 2 weeks were some of the strangest of my life. On the surface, everything continued as normal. I trained my replacement, a nervous graduate who looked at me with awe. I handed over transition documents. I smiled politely in the halls, but underneath I was watching the clock tick down to freedom, to the moment I could finally step out of the shadows. I remember the exit interview with Richard Vance, the legal counsel. He slid a stack of papers toward me, standard non-compete, confidentiality agreements, affirmations that I wasn't taking company property. I read each line carefully, then pushed the non-compete back toward him. I'm not signing this, I said. He blinked, caught off guard. It's standard procedure. It wasn't in my original contract, I replied, meeting his gaze evenly, and I'm not agreeing to it now. Something flickered in his eyes, a mix of curiosity and unease. He didn't press further. Perhaps he knew even then that Maddox's grip on me was already broken. That Friday at 5:17 p.m., I walked out of Maddox Logistics for the last time. No speeches, no send-offs, just the quiet sound of my heels on marble. As I left behind 12 years of invisibility, the glass doors closed behind me, and with them the weight I had carried for over a decade. By Monday morning, I was seated in a new corner office at Titan, sunlight streaming through wide windows. A team of specialists waiting for my direction. For the first time, I wasn't just executing someone else's vision. I was leading. And though I didn't show it, though I remained composed and professional, inside I was trembling, not with fear, but with the knowledge that my return, my real return, was only just beginning. Robert Maddox thought I was gone. What he didn't know was that I had come back, not as his employee, but as his reckoning. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my secret return. The first time I stood face to face with Robert Maddox after leaving his company, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who had once towered behind a mahogany desk, who had laughed so easily at my request for a raise, looked smaller. His suit was still immaculate, his hair still perfectly slicked back, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted, restless, searching for control in a situation where he had none. It happened 6 weeks after I joined Titan Logistics. By then, my systems were already live. Delivery times had dropped by 30%, cost by 25%. Clients whispered about Titan's new brilliance, and whispers soon became contracts. When Eastwood, Maddox's prized client, announced they were switching to Titan, my phone lit up with calls I ignored, each one bearing Robert's name. I let them ring. I wanted him to hear silence from me, to feel the same dismissal I had endured for 12 years. But Robert was persistent. One evening, as I walked toward my car in Titan's parking garage, I saw him leaning against the hood of my sedan. For a moment, I froze, caught between fury and disbelief. How far the mighty had fallen to be waiting in shadows, like a man begging for scraps. This is inappropriate, I said, my voice sharper than I'd ever dared to use with him before. You've put 300 jobs at risk, he said. his tone low, almost pleading. Titan took our largest client because of what you carried over. I didn't take anything that belonged to Maddox Logistics, I replied evenly. I took my personal intellectual property, systems I built on my own time with my own resources, systems your legal team never cared to secure. His jaw tightened, his polished smile cracking at the edges. No one will believe that. To the world, and it looks like espionage. I have data documentation, I said, holding his gaze. Every project, every entry, every conversation where ownership was never transferred. Your arrogance blinded you, Robert. You never valued me enough to realize what you were holding in your hands. He stepped closer then, desperation bleeding through his smooth facade. Name your price. Whatever Titan is paying, we'll double it, triple it. You can come back. You can come back? The words tasted bitter on my tongue. I thought of the nights spent alone in the office, of the mornings I stared at myself in the mirror and wondered if I was replaceable, of the day his laughter split me open. You once told me everyone was replaceable, even me. I'm just following your advice. For the first time, Robert Maddox had no answer. He stood there blinking, his breath visible in the cold air of the garage. For years, he had held power over me with his dismissals, his arrogance, his theft of my ideas. And now, stripped of that power, he looked like a man watching his empire crumble brick by brick. The confrontation didn't end in a screaming match. There were no grand gestures, no public humiliation. What made it powerful was its quietness, the steady reversal of power. I didn't need to yell, I had proof. I didn't need to beg, I had options. I didn't need to stay, I had already left. But it wasn't only Robert I confronted. Over the following weeks, I heard from others who had once stood silently as I was dismissed. Amanda sent an email, her tone brittle. I can't believe you would do this. People are losing their jobs because of you. She didn't mention that those same jobs had been made redundant years ago by the systems I built without recognition. Margaret from HR called to check in, her voice sweet but trembling. She spoke about community, about how Maddox had always valued me, as though repeating the lie could rewrite history. I listened politely, then reminded her of her own words. You're lucky to have stability. Don't rock the boat. She fell silent. Even Richard Vance, the legal counsel, reached out, though his words were different. There was no accusation, no pretense, only resignation. You did what we should have prevented, he said quietly over coffee one afternoon. And now the company is paying for it? His admission told me everything I needed to know. Robert hadn't just underestimated me. He had underestimated everyone, and his empire was cracking under the weight of years of arrogance. The confrontation wasn't a single moment. It was a series of reckonings. Robert in the parking garage, Amanda's bitter email, Margaret's faltering call, Vance's weary confession. One by one, the faces that had once dismissed me were forced to look at me again, this time from below. And yet, as satisfying as it was, there was a heaviness too. I saw the fear in Robert's eyes, the bitterness in Amanda's words, the regret in Vance's sigh. These weren't just villains. They were people trapped in the same system that had trapped me, people who had chosen comfort over courage, complicity over conflict. But I couldn't let their regret soften me, not yet, because the reckoning wasn't finished. The truth still lay hidden in archives, in emails, in memories that had been ignored for too long. And when that truth emerged, it wouldn't just prove me right. It would expose Robert Maddox for what he truly was. Not a leader, not a visionary, but a thief who built his empire on the brilliance of others. That revelation was coming, And when it did, there would be no laughter left in him at all. The truth has a way of hiding in plain sight. For years, I thought my silence had buried it, that the betrayals would remain tucked away in dusty emails and forgotten files. But when it finally surfaced, it came with the force of a tidal wave, undeniable, inescapable, and devastating. It was Richard Vance who first cracked the dam. Months after my departure, after Titan had swallowed more of Maddox's market share, he asked to meet me at a cafe halfway between our offices. His once polished appearance was fraying, grey streaks in his hair, lines deepening around his eyes. He stirred his coffee absently before leaning forward. "Emily," he said quietly, "there's something you don't know, something you need to hear." My guard went up immediately. Richard had always been Robert's shield, the man who deflected questions with standard procedure and buried employee concerns in red tape, but his voice now carried no authority, only weariness. "I warned Robert years ago," he continued. "When you first sent him those emails about your personal algorithms, the ones you marked as independent projects, I told him we needed to formalize ownership. You even suggested fair compensation. You CC'd me on the emails." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Robert dismissed them. He told me, just implement it. If it works, we'll sort out the details later." I froze. I didn't even remember sending those emails, so buried were they under years of exhaustion and dismissal. But Richard remembered. And more importantly, he still had them. "You mean he knew?" My voice trembled with disbelief. "He knew those systems were personal? He knew they weren't the company's property?" Richard nodded slowly. "He knew. He gambled that you were too loyal, too afraid of conflict to ever challenge him, and when you finally left, he demanded we sue you anyway. He knew he had no case, but his pride—" Richard's voice cracked. His pride wouldn't let him admit it. In that moment, the truth crystallized. Robert hadn't been ignorant. He hadn't been careless. He had been deliberate. He stole because he believed I would never fight back. And for 12 years, I proved him right. But now, everything had changed. I left the cafe with a copy of the emails Richard had archived. As I scrolled through them later that night, tears stung my eyes. There was my handwriting, my explanations, my explicit notes that these were personal projects created on my own time. And there was Robert's dismissive reply, "Just implement it. We'll deal with details later." The arrogance dripped from every word, and now those words were his undoing. The revelation spread quickly once it reached the courtroom. Maddox Logistics had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming theft of intellectual property. But when my lawyer presented the emails, the judge's face hardened. He dismissed the case in record time, calling Maddox's actions a catastrophic failure of corporate governance. Reporters pounced on the story. Headlines read, "CEO accused of exploiting employees' work. Maddox lawsuit collapses amid shocking evidence. The woman behind the algorithms." For the first time, my name was no longer a footnote. It was the headline. Inside the company, the truth rippled like an earthquake. Employees whispered in the hallways. Managers scrambled to distance themselves from Robert. Board members demanded answers. The mask Robert had worn for years was shattering, piece by piece, under the weight of undeniable proof. The most shocking moment came when Robert himself reached out, not with arrogance, but with something that almost sounded like humility. One evening, my phone rang. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Emily," his voice was rough, stripped of its usual smoothness. "I misjudged you." I said nothing, letting the silence press against him. "I thought you'd never leave. I thought you'd stay loyal, no matter how badly I treated you. I was wrong." A pause. "I knew those systems were yours. I knew, and I ignored it. And now the board has forced me out. For a long moment, I just listened to his breathing, uneven and weary. This was Robert Maddox, the man who once laughed at me, who had sneered that everyone was replaceable, now reduced to a broken voice on the other end of the line. "You destroyed everything," he whispered. "No," I said quietly. "You did that the day you decided people were disposable. You built a kingdom on the backs of people you never valued. The truth didn't destroy you, Robert. It revealed you." When I hung up, my hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the enormity of it all. The truth had finally been exposed. My identity, hidden for years behind someone else's shadow, was now undeniable. The world saw me. The industry saw me, and Robert saw me most of all. But with truth comes consequence. Because when masks fall away, everyone is forced to confront what lies beneath. And not everyone was ready to face it. The revelation was only the beginning. The reactions that followed would be even more explosive, more human, more heartbreaking than I ever imagined. The truth had been revealed, but the aftermath was more complicated than I ever imagined. It wasn't just about contracts lost, lawsuits dismissed, or boardroom collapses. It was about people, their faces, their voices, their pain. When Robert Maddox fell, he didn't fall alone. The entire company crumbled with him, and the tremors shook lives that had nothing to do with his arrogance or my revenge. The first reaction came from the employees still inside Maddox Logistics. My inbox flooded with messages from former colleagues. Some were supportive, even grateful. "You were the reason the company ever succeeded," one wrote. "I wish I'd had your courage sooner." Others, though, were bitter. Amanda's message stung the most. "You've ruined people's livelihoods. Do you feel proud of yourself?" I read it 3 times, my stomach twisting, before filing it in a folder I later labeled consequences. Then came Marlene. She had been at Maddox longer than me, head of customer service, a woman with kind eyes and a quiet laugh. We'd shared lunches, whispered frustrations, survived countless reorganizations. She showed up at my new office one afternoon, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "I lost my job last week," she said bluntly, her voice brittle, "along with my entire department, 37 people. She looked around at the sleek walls, the view from my window, my nameplate on the door. "I came to see if it was worth it, if what you got was worth what the rest of us lost." Her words hit harder than any lawsuit, any confrontation with Robert. I wanted to explain, to defend myself. I told her about the documentation, about Robert's theft, about my right to claim what was mine. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When I finished, she said softly, "I'm 56 years old, Emily. Who's going to hire me now?" I had no answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the list of names I began writing. Every former Maddox employee I knew who had been laid off. By morning, the list had grown to over 200. These weren't just statistics. They were people with mortgages, families, dreams, people who had been caught in the crossfire of Robert's arrogance and my revenge. I took the list to Daniel Reeves at Titan. "We can't just take their clients and leave their people to rot," I told him. "We need to hire them, train them, give them a place." He hesitated, calculating the cost, the logistics. But I pressed on. "This isn't just about business, it's about responsibility. We benefited from their collapse. We owe them something." And so Operation Rebound was born. Titan began interviewing every displaced Maddox employee, offering training programs, consulting roles, part-time opportunities for those nearing retirement. It wasn't charity, it was survival, compassion, and strategy rolled into one. The industry noticed. Journalists called it innovative, Clients praised our corporate responsibility. Applications to Titan tripled, but not everyone was forgiving. Jason, a former operations manager I had once mentored, refused to take my call. Patrice from accounting sent me a scathing email. "You betrayed us. You betrayed loyalty." I read it, felt the sting, and saved it in the same folder of consequences. It became a reminder that revenge, no matter how righteous, is never clean. Even Robert himself reacted in ways I hadn't anticipated. After the lawsuit collapsed and the board ousted him, he appeared at my office once more. Jean was the confident CEO who had laughed at me. His shoulders were hunched, his voice stripped of pride. "You've destroyed everything," he said, standing in my doorway. "No," I corrected. "You destroyed it when you decided loyalty was worthless. I just stopped letting you take from me." For the first time, he didn't argue. He only nodded, eyes hollow, before leaving without another word. That moment, more than any court victory or contract won, showed me the depth of his regret. He had finally realized the cost of his arrogance, and it was everything, but regret didn't only belong to Robert. It lingered in me, too. Late at night, when the city quieted and the accolades faded, I thought about the Marlenes of the world, the people who had lost not because of their failures, but because of Robert's choices and my retaliation. My revenge had given me recognition, power, respect, but it had also left scars, collateral damage that no lawsuit or program could erase. The reactions from everyone, supportive, bitter, regretful, desperate, swirled together into a storm I hadn't expected. I had dreamed of vindication, of triumph. What I hadn't anticipated was the complexity of victory, that it could be both liberating and crushing, that it could taste like justice and guilt all at once. Revenge, I realized, doesn't end with the downfall of your enemy. It echoes in the lives it touches, in the voices that remind you that no victory is without consequence. And those echoes were only just beginning. Standing at the podium 1 year after I walked out of Maddox Logistics, I should have felt only triumph. The room was packed with industry leaders, the flash of cameras bright as diamonds, the plaque in my hands heavy with recognition, the Innovation Award given to me, Emily Carson, for revolutionizing supply chain systems. My team sat in the front row, faces glowing with pride. Many of them were once Maddox employees, now thriving at Titan. But as I looked out at that sea of faces, I didn't see just celebration. I saw ghosts. The people who had never made it across. The ones who had been laid off and never found another job. The ones too old to be retrained, too tired to start over. For every smile in the audience, I saw a shadow reminding me that my revenge had not been clean. I cleared my throat, my voice carrying across the auditorium. Innovation isn't just about algorithms or systems, I said. It's about people. It's about seeing them as irreplaceable, not disposable. Companies that forget this truth fail. The applause was thunderous, but inside me there was only silence, the silence of questions that had no easy answers. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me. She looked barely out of college, clutching a portfolio as though it was armor. "Ms. Carson," she said nervously, "I just started in algorithm development at Titan. How did you know when to stand up for yourself? I don't want to make the same mistakes." Her question lodged in me like a stone. I thought about 12 years of silence, of swallowing betrayals, of waiting for recognition that never came. I thought about the night Robert laughed at me, about the moment I believed him, about the fire that finally forced me to act. "I waited too long," I told her gently. "Don't do that. Don't let fear or loyalty chain you to people who don't value you." "But aren't you worried?" she asked, "about seeming difficult, ungrateful?" I smiled. though it carried the weight of everything I had lived. Those are labels people use when they want to pay you less than you're worth. Don't let them stick. She nodded, her eyes shining, and for the first time I realized that maybe my revenge was no longer just mine. It was a lesson I could pass on, a torch I could hand to others. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, I saw him, Robert Maddox, standing near the exit. No longer the untouchable CEO, no longer surrounded by admirers. Just a man who had lost everything. Our eyes met. He didn't sneer, didn't mock, didn't laugh. He only nodded once, acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. I nodded back. In that brief moment, we were equals. Both of us had been changed by that day in his office, when a 10% raise request became the spark that burned down an empire. Weeks later, a package arrived at my office. Inside was a framed Wall Street Journal article analyzing Maddox's collapse and Titan's rise. Attached was a handwritten note. You were never replaceable. Robert. I hung it on my wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Value isn't determined by others. It's something you must claim for yourself, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. That same month, I launched a mentorship program for women in tech. Our first workshop focused on salary negotiation and intellectual property protection. Over 300 women attended. Some were fresh graduates. Others were veterans who had lived through decades of being undervalued. Marlene helped me organize it. The young woman who had once asked me about standing up for herself, her name was Tessa, now led her own team and spoke on the panel. At the end of the workshop, someone asked me, "Don't you feel bad about what happened to Maddox Logistics?" The room grew quiet. I thought of the hundreds of employees who had lost their jobs. I thought of the bitterness in Amanda's email, the exhaustion in Richard's sigh, the question in Marlene's eyes. Was it worth it? I feel responsible, I said slowly, but not guilty. There's a difference. I took what was mine. I stopped apologizing for my worth. And while the collapse of Maddox was tragic, it was inevitable. No company built on arrogance and exploitation can last forever. As the room erupted in applause, I felt the truth settle in me at last. Revenge hadn't been about watching Robert lose his title or seeing Maddox crumble. It hadn't even been about the award in my hands or the office with my name on the door. Real revenge was this: discovering my worth and refusing to let anyone discount it again. Creating a workplace where others would never have to wait 12 years for recognition. When I looked around at the faces of those women, bright, determined, unafraid, I realized I had finally transformed my pain into something greater. The laughter that once cut me had become the catalyst for a new world, one where no one would be invisible again. And as I walked off that stage, the weight of the past still with me, but no longer crushing, I knew my story wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about dignity, about humanity, about never forgetting that behind every algorithm, every system, every number, there is a person who deserves to be seen. That is the lesson I carry. That is the life I choose. And that is the revenge that endures.